All right, welcome back. We're going to do part 2 of the Tim Pool versus Sam Seder debate, if you want to call it a debate. I would say that compared to what was going on with that ridiculous David Pakman discussion that he had, this was a breath of fresh air. Even though, let's be honest, Sam Seder is very disingenuous, and he shows that some of these people who are staunch, dyed-in-the-wool leftists, as opposed to, I guess, wobbly leftists like Tim Pool, people who aren't really sure of what they believe in anymore, and they kind of don't have a real home politically. People who are still fixed on the left literally cannot see the way the rest of America sees the world. I'm not talking about just people on the conservative side. I'm talking about people who are disaffected politically, people who aren't even engaged in the political process, people who are apathetic, people who are far, far leftists seem to have this belief that the rest of the world is as outraged as they are, and only this small minority of idiots and greedy bastards are screwing everyone else over, and those are what you call Republicans and conservatives. So without further ado, I'm going to put on the video, and this time they're talking a little bit more about polling as opposed to part 1 of the video where I didn't do this preamble, where they were talking more about presidential powers.
And that Republicans got clobbered in a record-breaking off-year election, and unprecedented.
So we're expecting massive turnout for 2020.
Exactly.
Which, according to Moody's, if it's historical, Trump loses by a few electoral votes. So here's what I'm saying, right? We have Trump raising $15 million in a day, specifically off of impeachment, campaigning on.
So notice when Tim brings it up this time, Sam Seder isn't really objecting to raising Moody's or anything because he doesn't know what Moody's is. Moody's is this analytical firm that they do a lot of economic projections, market analysis, things like that. And they have predicted that in all likelihood, Trump will have a pretty easy re-election. There are ways that he can lose. One of them is unusually high turnout if the Democrats are motivated. And that could happen even if the economy is doing relatively well. But at this point, Sam Seder doesn't care if he brings up Moody's. He simply lets the remark go. We'll see how it goes later.
On it. He's, I guess they're calling it, I forgot what they're calling it, but it's been reported by numerous outlets that Trump has seen a boon among his base, similar to the Kavanaugh effect. In 2018, moderates did really, really well.
You mean the thing that happened a month before the Democrats had an unprecedented victory against the Republicans?
So specifically, the Kavanaugh effect refers to state level and how that'll affect the presidency, not suburban districts.
So what Sam Seder is referring to is he's calling last year's big victory in the midterms in the House, he's calling that a historic victory. But it's not really that historic if you look at midterm elections. And let's think about how far we want to go back. In 1934, the Democrats increased their so they were able to win in 1934, they were able to win an extra 9 seats. In 1938, they lost 72 seats apparently. And then you would see in 1970, Richard Nixon actually lost a number of seats, the Republican, in the midterm. You saw Jerry Ford actually lost 48 seats. Okay? The Republicans lost 48 seats in that one. In 1966, Johnson lost 47 seats as a Democrat and kept the majority because the Democrats at the time had a massive majority in the House. In 1978, Carter lost 15 seats. But yeah, you have several cases where you had more swings for the party that was not in the in the White House. So let's look at them. 1974, 48 seats with Jerry Ford, lost to the Democrats. 1966, Johnson lost 47 seats to the Republicans. You can see in 1982, Reagan lost 26 seats to the Democrats, increased their majority. Then you have Clinton in 1994, lost 54 seats and gave the Republicans control of the House and the Senate. So in 1994, you have Clinton losing control of both the House and the Senate, losing 10 senators. Can you understand how hard it is to lose 10 senators in the same year? Well, that's what happened. And the Democrats were obliterated, and that's when Newt Gingrich and the Contracted with America and the new impeachment procedures were beginning against Clinton. That's how it all started in 1994. That was a historical year. What else is an historical year if you're just talking about the House? How about 2010, the Tea Party revolution, where Obama lost 63 seats in the House to basically punt the majority back to the GOP. And he also lost 6 seats in the Senate, bringing his majority there down to 51. It was not going to, if Delaware had not nominated this Fruit Loop, Christine O'Donnell, who was this really, really, I guess, religious person to be the Republican nominee, it's possible that the Republicans would have forced it to be 50 votes, and therefore any close vote, Vice President Biden would have had to be at the Senate in order to get a majority. So, yeah, there have been several, quote-unquote, historical midterm elections that Sam Seder is ignoring.
No, but so when you say the Kavanaugh effect, you're talking about the Kavanaugh hearings, which took place.
The senators who lost and the gains made in the Senate for Republicans, yes.
Those were all red states.
The Kavanaugh effect isn't referring to the losses, right? So the Kavanaugh effect isn't referring to Congress. It was specifically that at the state level, which more accurately reflects presidential elections, the Kavanaugh effect resulted in...
What do you mean by the state level?
Senators versus Congress districts.
Those were all red states.
Where the Democrat, the red state Democrats got kicked out for not supporting Kavanaugh.
Those were all states that Donald Trump won in. I mean, they're deeply red states.
Right. So then I guess the argument is that it was inevitable Trump was going to win those states over in 2018.
Was it inevitable that those senators were going to lose? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then, so why would we assume that anything's going to change if the track is staying, solid except for the scandals?
I think red states. I think it's going to be. Yeah, I think he's going to win red states, but in purple states.
Did you see the Moody's analytics?
So I think that, and we're going to get back to the Moody's analytics in a second, but and that's a very funny moment. But how clear is it that states are going to go a certain way? Let's remember what happened in Michigan. You had for months and months and months, there were all these polls that were predicting Clinton was going to win, even if the margin kept getting more narrow. Even within a week of the election, Clinton was predicted in 3 polls to win by 5 points, whereas Trump was only predicted to win in 1 poll that was pretty close to the election by 2%. Trump ended up winning by a spread of 0.3%. And the rest is history. Now people are blaming Russia for it. Well, what happened to all those polling agencies? It was pretty obvious going into the election that Hillary Clinton was going to win Michigan, right? That's not what happened. This shows exactly how much polling is worth paying attention to. And Sam Seder is a guy who really, he's one of these people who goes and uses the polling as if it's gospel. In Minnesota, also in 2016, you had every poll was predicting Clinton by a very, very strong majority, except for one, Gravis, which was in September, which predicted a tie. But every other one was by over 5%. And as the election grew nearer, it actually had it by 8% and 10% for Clinton. And in the end, Minnesota went for Clinton by 1.5%. So these polling agencies are in many cases oversampling, especially oversampling Democrats, as we've seen many times. How about in 2018 with the Missouri Senate? You had, over the course of this election, a number of polls that did predict that Claire McCaskill would survive, and in the end, she lost by 6%. Right? Even the RCP average was 0.6% in favor of Josh Hawley. He ended up overperforming by 5.4%, perhaps because of the whole Kavanaugh hearing. How about that? So, what's his name? Sam Seder seems to believe that the Kavanaugh hearing didn't really change that much, but many of these polls, I think, indicated that Hawley would have a much more narrow victory, and the opposite happened. Sam Seder seems to believe that states are solidly red, whereas in reality, I think voters are often willing to have an open mind and vote for Democrats if they think that the Democrat is more receptive to them on local issues. Here in Florida, on not here where I live, but in these, I live in Ohio, but in these polls, Scott was predicted to lose. Rick Scott, who was the governor at the time, was predicted to lose to the incumbent Bill Nelson by 2.4%. And you can see in many of the polls, Nelson was predicted to be comfortably ahead. Quinnipiac, which is one of the least reliable ones, predicted 7% spread for Nelson. You had Emerson by 5%, St. Pete by 4%, and only Harris X and Trafalgar predicted Scott. Of course, Rick Scott ended up winning. So generally, you see polling being rather unreliable, and people who say, well, this is a deeply red state. Florida, I would say, is not necessarily a deeply red state. I think it trended red for a very long time. I don't know where it's headed right now. A lot of people are saying, oh, there's going to be a lot of effects from immigration or from new people moving in from states like New York and New Jersey who are going to change Florida from red to blue. So that election last year, it obliterated the Democrats on the statewide level, and they're going to have to play catch up, even though demographic shifts seem to show that they're going to win more. So I don't know why Sam Seder doesn't want to talk about that. Let's hear what he says now that Tim brings up the Moody's model again.
He's going to win red states, but in purple states, and
did you see the Moody's analytics?
And anywhere where there is an R5 district or less, I think that that person's going to be in deep trouble. You're talking about states where the partisan index is something like in double digits.
Did you see Moody's?
So what he's talking about, Sam Seder, is, hey, look at all these vulnerable congressional districts. Trump is going to be wiped out over there. Those districts, a lot of them already swung to the Democrat in 2018. And based on the performance of Congress, now the Democrats have to defend that territory. Now those Democrats are going to have resources dedicated to keeping those congressmen in office, while at the same time, they're fighting an incumbent for the presidency with a massive funding advantage.
He's at recent analytics release on the projections for 2020?
No.
They're saying with an average voter turnout, Trump handedly wins. With low voter turnout, Trump sweeps nearly 400 electoral votes. And only with a historical high will the Democrats secure 279 votes. So Moody's is saying Trump is going to cruise through.
And if that's the case, if Moody's is right, then the key is you need to motivate the Democratic base. Now, when the Democrats opened up this session of Congress, they passed 60 pieces of legislation that were a wish list for Democratic voters. We barely heard about this.
Absolutely.
They want Democrats. We barely heard about it. The news barely reported on it. Mitch McConnell, of course, wouldn't allow a single one of those to take a vote. I think there's something like 200 bills that he's preventing from having a vote.
Yep.
And so if we take the thing that you have presented from Moody's as gospel, which is that we need to have an unprecedented turnout by Democrats to win, then it only makes sense that you should deliver for the Democrats who want to come out. And they are all saying, in massive numbers,
Yep.
impeach Donald Trump. So I think you've strengthened my argument, at least in terms of the politics. Now,
But not moderates.
what moderates?
Moderate voters that make up 60+% of the country. Or is it 40? Sorry,
I don't
45
know
or so.
what you're looking at, but the fact of the matter is that the research I just interviewed.
So this is a funny moment when Tim, obviously he overstated the number of independents that are in the electorate. But the fact is that there's a lot of people who are out there who don't necessarily line up with either party. And for Sam Seder to go to Tim Pool and say, hey, this Democratic House, which has passed all of these bills, 60 plus bills, that won't be passed by the Senate, they are giving you your wish list for things that you should probably want to vote for. So therefore, you should turn out to vote for the Democratic nominee for president, and you should support the impeachment effort. This is a very narrow ideological way to look at politics. It is the same as if you were to say, look, there's all of these ideas that we had, and we talked about in the conference room all day, and everybody really liked them. So you have to be on board because all of these ideas are really great, and we need you to buy into it. Well, it doesn't say he's not talking about the feasibility of the projects and ideas. He's not talking about whether the ideas are actually supported by the voters or not. He's not talking about whether the ideas themselves are polling very well, which sometimes they do talk about. But in this case, he's just saying, hey, look at all this legislation that the Democrats passed that they know would not be able to get passed in the Senate. Why don't you buy into this? It's a very, I guess, capricious argument because he's essentially saying, you're not being a team player, Tim, because you don't want us to succeed because we're trying so hard. Another thing is that Tim is pointing out that there's plenty of people who would look at those 60 plus bills and they might see 10 or 20 that they might agree with. You know, for instance, let's say on prescription drug price controls, or they might see something about increasing funding for vocational training. Those are things that are policies that would poll very well across political divides. Even some Republicans would probably vote for those. But then there are pieces of legislation that would definitely hurt the Democrats. The most glaring example was the one where the House voted to eliminate the protections for female athletes when you're talking about gender segregated sports. So you could, on the federal level, if this bill passed, see any effort to gender segregate any sports be knocked down by the law, and any male athlete could declare their gender to be female and go compete in the women's league. Those are things that Sam Seder is oblivious to because he doesn't seem to believe that the rest of the country could have a different opinion from him. And if they do, he thinks that they are stuck in the mud and have to be dragged out.
A woman named Rebecca Bitkofer. She was the only person to predict the Democratic wave in 2018. She got it down to almost the exact number of seats they were going to pick up 4 to 5 months out. And she says that paradigm that you're talking about, where there is somehow these swing voters. Presumably that's what you mean by moderate.
Pew Research, 38% are independent.
Well, that's right. She says those independents either lean Democrat or lean Republican. And the question isn't whether or not they're going to be persuaded to switch the way that they lean. The question is, are they going to come out and vote? And she says the same thing that motivates people who are solidly Democrat motivates those who lean Democrat. Same with the Republicans. The same things that motivate definite Republicans also motivate lean Republicans. And so the idea is that these, what you call independents or moderates, I think moderate is probably a misnomer, but these independents, these less likely people to vote, although we know if they vote, we can predict how they'll vote. The question is, will they come out? And negative partisanship drives those people. And that's why that also reinforces my theory that impeachment is going to help. Because we know that these, if you look at, the
So Sam Seder's entire premise here is that the voters have already made up their mind as far as what they believe. No one is ever going to change their mind about whether they are pro-choice or pro-life, or to what degree they are or not, or whether they believe in the strong southern border or not. I personally, during the 2016 election, where I was going to vote for likely the Republican, I couldn't care less about the southern border. Now, because of a lot of the stories and publicity about what's going on over there, I could not bring myself to vote for any Democrat at any level of government. It just wouldn't happen. But there are a lot of people who could go back and forth during different election cycles. You see states, for example, Louisiana, which has a Democratic governor, that there's people who on the rest of their ballot they would vote for a Republican, and they ended up voting for a Democrat. The same thing over in Kentucky. Their last governor, not the one currently governing, Steve Beshear, was a Democrat, even though Kentucky has voted Republican for almost 50 years. I think it's almost every presidential election they vote for the Republican. You also see the opposite. There's a number of blue states where there are Republican governors that are governing and actually very, very popular for whatever reason. I don't understand it. Massachusetts has Charlie Baker. He was reelected with over 65% of the vote. You have Maryland, where Larry Hogan was reelected with over 70%. I think it was like over 70%. You also had, I think it was New Hampshire and Vermont. So you have all of these New England states, all of which vote consistently blue most of the time, have voted in Republican governors. Why is it? Because when you're able to connect with people on the local level, ideology doesn't necessarily prevail. You're able to connect with people on various pressing issues. In Florida, I believe in 2022, you're going to see a massive victory for Ron DeSantis, who's the governor who was just elected by a very narrow margin in 2018. I'm predicting he could win 60 to 65% of the vote because he just seems to be pretty popular. These are things that Sam Seder doesn't pick up on because he thinks people are motivated by these very, very, rigid pillars of their beliefs, and he just can't abide by it. But anyway, I have to go for right now. I will probably try to do another video on this. I appreciate those of you that tuned in. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also, subscribe to me on BitChute and on Minds.com, as well as on Subscribestar if you want to donate. All of those, you can find me at Chef Leopard, and also on Subscribestar at Starscream85. And I'll talk to you later.
Inside my future eye, what I see just makes me cry.